Part 1. What happened to the bodies after famous medieval battles? Hey guys, tonight we're settling in for one of those historical questions that, well, no one really asks until 3 a.m. when the mind wanders into strange territory. You've probably heard of famous medieval battles. Hastings, Agincourt, Crecy, or that one your high school teacher mentioned right before the bell rang and you immediately forgot. We remember the kings and knights, the longbows and swords, the dramatic charge that changed the fate of nations. But here's the part that never gets into the history textbooks. After the dust cleared and the bards packed up their loots, what happened to the bodies? Because medieval battles didn't exactly come with cleanup crews. There were no UN humanitarian teams rolling in with stretchers. You had tens of thousands of bodies, men, horses, sometimes women and children caught in the chaos, all lying in the mud. And this isn't the kind of problem you can just ignore. A field full of rotting corpses is a logistical nightmare. Disease, stench, superstitious panic, and the not-so-small issue that nobles were supposed to be buried properly. Ideally in a fancy church where generations could come and mumble about their greatness. So let's get comfortable, dim the lights, and drift through the strangely overlooked afterlife of the battlefield. Let's begin with something simple. Imagine the Battle of Hastings in 1066. William the Conqueror defeats Harold Godwinson. It's one of the most famous battles in English history. Now, most people stop the story at Harold allegedly getting an arrow in the eye. What they don't think about is, okay, Harold is dead, but he's the King of England. He doesn't just get left in the mud like some anonymous peasant. The Norman chroniclers couldn't quite agree on what happened to Harold's body. Some claimed William ordered it buried at sea, like a Viking-style good riddance. Others said Harold's mother offered William a fortune for the body, and William refused, which is, by the way, a very conqueror move. And there's even a story that Harold's mistress was brought to identify him among the corpses, and she recognized him by certain, well, let's say, unique body marks, very medieval CSI. Now, the regular soldiers, the hundreds or thousands of Anglo-Saxon thanes, peasants dragged in to fight, and Norman knights who didn't make it, they weren't given dramatic endings. Most of them were just buried in large pits. Mass graves were the standard solution. You dig as fast as you can, throw in as many bodies as possible, sprinkle some earth on top, and hope it doesn't start bubbling up with plague in a week. And speaking of plague, medieval people genuinely feared miasma, or the belief that rotting bodies released poisonous air. They didn't know about bacteria, but they knew battlefields reeked of death and that people got sick afterward. Which meant, ironically, they were kind of right. The stench wasn't just unpleasant, it carried real risk. So you had this mix of urgency and ritual. Nobles and knights were supposed to be treated with dignity. Their families wanted their armor, their swords, their signet rings, their teeth if nothing else. Bodies were stripped of valuables, often by looters, sometimes by the victors themselves. Then, if you were important enough, someone carted your remains off to a monastery or a cathedral. If not, congratulations, you were dumped in a ditch with everyone else. And let's float forward to another famous clash, the Battle of Towton in 1461. This was during the Wars of the Roses, England's favorite dynastic soap opera. Towton is often called the bloodiest battle ever fought in English soil. Estimates say around 28,000 men died in a single day. That's a horrifying number, even by modern standards. Now, try to picture that. Snow was falling, the battlefield stretched for miles, and by the end, the ground was essentially carpeted in bodies. What do you even do with that? You can't possibly give everyone a Christian burial with candles and hymns. Priests weren't signing up for overtime. So what we know from archaeological digs is that the dead were shoveled into mass graves, long trenches filled with bodies, laid side by side or stacked like firewood, some with their armor still on, some stripped down to nothing. And here's the fun detail. Sometimes they didn't even bother to separate sides. Yorkist and Lancastrian corpses were thrown in together, even though their families would have been horrified. Imagine hating your enemy in life, then spending eternity spooning with him in a muddy grave.
Of course, the bigger the battle, the messier the aftermath. The Battle of Visby in 1361 is one of the most fascinating examples, because we actually have direct evidence. On the island of Gotland in Sweden, a peasant militia faced off against professional Danish troops. Spoiler, it didn't go well for the peasants. Thousands died, many still wearing their armor, because they weren't used to stripping the dead for loot before burial. Archaeologists excavated Visby in the 20th century and found these haunting skeletons, whole groups buried together, still with broken swords jammed in ribs, helmets crushed into skulls, chainmail twisted into bones. It's one of the clearest windows we have into the grim reality of post-battle cleanup. Nobody had time for ceremony. It was shovel, dump, cover. Next. Now, let's not forget the role of animals, because nature doesn't politely wait for you to finish your religious rituals. If bodies weren't buried quickly, wolves, stray dogs, crows, and rats moved in. Chroniclers mention fields black with birds after major battles, dogs gnawing on fallen knights, horses trampling over half-buried corpses, and yes, sometimes starving survivors would loot the dead for food as well. We don't need to dwell on that, but it happened. Another fascinating angle is ransoming and recovering noble corpses. For the medieval elite, your body was basically political capital, even in death. Think of Richard the Lionheart. He wasn't technically a battlefield corpse. He was shot by a crossbow bolt and died during a siege. But his death in 1199 sparked a bizarre post-mortem journey. His body was divided up like a medieval jigsaw puzzle, his heart buried in Rouen, his entrails in Chaillot, and the rest in Fontevraud Abbey. Because apparently one grave just wasn't enough. And this wasn't unusual. Important figures might have their bodies embalmed, boiled down to bones for easier transport, or even cut up so different churches could claim relics. Imagine your intestines in one cathedral, your femur in another, and your skull making a guest appearance somewhere else. We'll gently drift toward another example. Agincourt in 1415. Everyone remembers Henry V's stirring speech, or at least Shakespeare's version. But few people think about the messy Monday that came after. Thousands of French knights lay dead in their armor, their horses collapsed beside them. And Henry, the ultimate practical guy, ordered the French dead stripped and buried in pits. The English dead got a little more respect, but still, no neat rows of tombstones, just trenches, mud, and the faint hope of avoiding pestilence. And if you're wondering about hygiene, no, they didn't exactly have disinfectant. The solution was basically bury them deep and hope for the best. We'll pause here before moving further into the weirder and darker logistics of medieval corpse management. In the next stretch, we'll glide over to how entire towns were sometimes forced into weeks of corpse duty, how battlefield relics became prized souvenirs, and why some kings wanted their bodies displayed before burial, because nothing says power like showing off your corpse.
Part 2. The Long Cleanup. So we left off with Agincourt and the messy reality of battlefield graves. Let's keep drifting across the centuries, because the truth is, medieval corpse management wasn't just a single-day inconvenience. It could drag on for weeks, sometimes months, depending on weather, politics, and how much anyone actually cared about the dead. Imagine you're a peasant living near a battlefield. You weren't fighting. You weren't nobility. You didn't get a speech in a Shakespeare play. But guess what? Congratulations, you just won the job of corpse disposal. Local villages were often forced into service to bury the fallen. This wasn't volunteer work. Lords would literally command the peasants to grab shovels and deal with thousands of decomposing men and horses. Now horses, let's talk about them for a moment. We always focus on the humans, but battles could leave thousands of war horses dead in the mud. And war horses weren't small creatures. These were massive destriers, bred like medieval tanks, each one weighing over 1,000 pounds. Try moving that without a forklift. The solution was the same as with the men. Dig big pits, shove them in, cover it fast, and hope the smell faded eventually. Spoiler, it didn't. Another cheerful little fact, some towns and monasteries got rich off battles, not because of loot, but because they charged fees for burying nobles. Families, desperate for a proper Christian burial, would pay good money to have their loved one tucked neatly into consecrated ground, rather than lying out in the mud. Of course, this often meant stripping the corpse down to whatever bones were manageable, transporting those, and leaving the rest behind. You know, efficiency. There's also the issue of recognition. Imagine trying to identify a loved one after a battle. No photos, no dog tags, just piles of broken bodies. Families often sent retainers or widows to scan the battlefield, which sounds noble in theory, but in practice it was horrifying. Decay set in fast. Helmets and armor might obscure faces, and plenty of looters weren't shy about taking boots, belts, and teeth. So yeah, recognition wasn't always possible. Many families simply never knew what happened to their relatives. Now let's slide gently over to a different kind of story. The display of bodies. Sometimes the victors didn't bury the dead right away. They showed them off, for intimidation, for propaganda, to make a point. Take the aftermath of the Battle of Stirling Bridge in 1297. William Wallace, yes, Braveheart Wallace, defeated the English. According to chroniclers, some English nobles were left unburied deliberately as a warning. Their corpses rotted in the open as proof of Scottish defiance. And the English, when they later captured Wallace, returned the favor by not only executing him, but also dismembering his body and putting pieces on display across the country. Recycling, medieval style. And then you have the Battle of Bannockburn in 1314, another Scottish triumph. Chroniclers describe thousands of Englishmen dead, many unburied for weeks, which sounds awful, but it was also a deliberate insult. Denying burial was considered one of the greatest disgraces in the medieval world. Forget losing the battle. Lying unburied meant your soul might wander in unrest. This brings us to one of the strangest practices, the boiling of corpses. Yes, you heard me. If a nobleman died far from home, his body needed to be transported, but rotting flesh and long journeys didn't mix well. So enter the macabre art of mos teutonicus, the German custom of boiling a corpse until only the bones remained. The flesh was disposed of locally, and the clean bones could be carried home neatly in a box. Very practical, very unsettling. This was used on kings, knights, and crusaders. When Louis IX of France died on crusade in 1270, his body was boiled down so the bones could be brought back to Paris. When Richard the Lionheart's dad, Henry II, died, his body began to stink so badly they had to do a fast-prack embalming job that didn't really help. Nobility didn't always smell noble. And here's the kicker. Some churches banned boiling because it sounded a little too much like desecration. But it kept happening anyway because, well, nobody wanted to carry a liquefying corpse across Europe. Let's drift toward another angle, archaeological ghosts. When modern excavations dig up battlefields, we get to peek into this forgotten world of burial pits. At Towton, the skeletons show blunt force trauma, arrow wounds, broken teeth. One poor soul had half his jaw hacked off. Others had their skulls smashed in with poleaxes. The way the bodies were arranged shows the speed of burial. Tossed side by side, sometimes face down, arms tangled. There's no dignity in a mass grave. It's logistics, not ritual. At Visby, as I mentioned earlier, the skeletons were left in armor, which is fascinating because usually armor was too valuable to waste. But the sheer scale of death overwhelmed looting. Archaeologists found men buried with chainmail shirts still wrapped around shattered ribs. One had a sword literally stuck in his leg bone. You can almost hear the medieval gravediggers muttering, "Good enough," as they covered the trench. And then, of course, there's the smell. Chroniclers talk about battlefields being unapproachable for weeks. The stench of blood, rot, and manure, because armies weren't exactly neat about their latrines, made areas uninhabitable. In some cases, fields were abandoned for years. Crops wouldn't grow, locals avoided them. The land itself felt cursed, which, in medieval logic, it probably was. One lovely example, after the Battle of Cannae. Okay, technically not medieval, but worth mentioning. Romans supposedly found piles of bones years later, bleached white under the sun. Medieval people knew these stories, and they added to the sense that battlefields were haunted landscapes, full of restless souls. And speaking of souls, religion mattered here. The church insisted that even enemy soldiers deserved burial, at least in theory. But practice? Let's just say the rules bent quickly. If you were wealthy, you got prayers, candles, monks chanting Latin. If you were poor, you got dumped in a ditch. Salvation wasn't free. It was a subscription service. Some towns even made pilgrim sites out of old battlefields. Shrines popped up where nobles died or relics were recovered. Bones could become holy souvenirs, especially if you were martyred in a religious fight like the Crusades. Which means, yes, some medieval skulls ended up being treated like baseball cards. Collect them all. Let's pause here again before drifting further into the idea of medieval memory, how people remembered or conveniently forgot these mass death sites. Next, we'll look at how battles left ghostly reputations that lasted for centuries, how kings spun battlefield burials into propaganda, and why entire generations lived with the smell of decay in their fields.
Part 3. Haunted Fields and Royal Spin. So, we've covered mass graves, boiling corpses, and the general smell of death. Let's drift now into what happened after the burials. The memories, the stories, and the sometimes hilariously desperate attempts of kings to spin disaster into dignity. Because here's the truth, a battlefield never really went away. Sure, the bodies might be underground, but everyone knew what was beneath their fields. Farmers, plowing years later, still turned up bones. Shepherds stumbled across rusted swords, and people whispered about ghosts. Haunted landscapes. Medieval people lived in a world buzzing with spirits. Ghosts weren't a rare horror movie concept. They were your neighbors. And battlefields? Well, they were basically the busiest ghost real estate market in town. Take Towton again. Chroniclers later claimed that villagers heard the clash of swords in the night for decades after the battle. Horses galloping, men screaming, and disembodied cries echoing across the snow. Was it really ghosts? Or just peasants entertaining themselves with a good scare? Hard to say. But it's telling that people avoided those fields long after the fighting was done. At Bannockburn, locals swore the ground itself bled. And at Visby, where those poor peasants were shoved into pits in their armor, the legend grew that their spirits still wandered, rattling chains and muttering about Danish taxes. Because if you die angry, you stay angry. Now, kings and nobles understood the importance of burials. You couldn't just lose a battle and leave your reputation rotting in the mud with your corpse. So they got creative.
Take Richard III, the famously hunchbacked last Plantagenet. He died at Bosworth in 1485, and his body was treated with all the dignity of a trash bag, stripped, slung over a horse, displayed in Leicester, and hastily buried in a friary with no fancy tomb, which was frankly not a great look for a king. For centuries, people thought his bones were lost, until, of course, they turned up under a parking lot in 2012. Not the royal mausoleum he probably imagined. Other kings fared slightly better. After the Battle of Hastings, William made sure his noblemen were buried properly, because reputation mattered. You wanted your allies to know you'd be taken care of, even in defeat, which is why royal propaganda often included stories of miraculous burials, angels guiding corpses, or kings looking surprisingly fresh even after weeks in the sun. Medieval PR at its finest. And let's not forget the church. Because if there was money to be made, monks were on it. Monasteries near battlefields often became custodians of noble remains. Families would donate lands or gold in exchange for prayers over the deceased. Monks might even exaggerate the sanctity of certain graves, claiming visions of light or sweet smells rising from the pits. Nothing like turning a mass grave into a pilgrimage hotspot. At Crécy, the French defeat in 1346, nearby monasteries quickly became crowded with noble burials. Tombs, chapels, and candles everywhere. Not necessarily because the monks cared, but because the noble families kept the donations rolling. A rotting battlefield could be spun into a spiritual gold mine. Now, this one is a little stranger. Sometimes the remains themselves became relics. Knights killed in crusades were especially popular candidates for sainthood. Their bones were collected, polished, and displayed as holy objects, which meant that even the most gruesome battlefield deaths could end in glory, provided someone decided you looked holy enough. And not all relics were official. Ordinary folks sometimes scavenged battlefield bones as keepsakes. A skull in the corner of your tavern was a reminder of war's cost, or a nice conversation starter when the ale got flowing. Very tasteful interior decoration. But let's bring it back to something practical. The smell. Because medieval people wrote about this more than anything. The odor of death lingered. Even buried bodies didn't stay buried if the pits were shallow. Dogs dug them up, rains washed them out, bones worked their way back to the surface. One French chronicler wrote that after a certain battle, the smell was so bad that not even the air itself could be breathed, which is a poetic way of saying, yeah, it stunk. And villagers living nearby had to deal with it for seasons afterwards. You didn't just move on from a medieval battle. You farmed around it. You lived with it. You remembered it in every foul gust of wind. And here's the strange irony. As much as people wanted to forget the horror, they also couldn't resist turning battlefields into symbols. Kings built monuments, poets wrote verses, families told stories about noble ancestors who fell bravely, even if the reality was that Grandpa got dumped in a ditch with 50 strangers. Battlefields became teaching tools. Don't rebel or you'll end up like these poor souls. Don't anger God, or he'll make sure you rot unburied. Every pit of bones carried a moral, and medieval people loved a moral almost as much as they loved a ghost story. We'll pause here again before we slide into part 4. Next, we'll explore what happened when really famous battles left too many bodies to bury at all, how scavengers made a career out of picking over the dead, and why some medieval rulers literally ordered bones dug up decades later just to make a point.
Part 4. Scavengers, Bone Recycling, and Petty Kings. So far, we've seen the pits, the smells, the monks cashing in. But let's float further into the stranger corners of battlefield aftermath, because what happened to bodies wasn't always just about burial. Sometimes it was about recycling. Sometimes it was about scavengers turning corpses into side hustles. And sometimes It was about kings digging up old enemies just to insult them twice. Battlefield scavengers. After the fighting, armies didn't just march away and leave it at that. There was always someone who hung back. Scavengers. They weren't official grave diggers. They weren't noble families collecting relatives. They were opportunists. Picture it, a field littered with the dead. Armor, swords, daggers, boots, belts. These were valuable items. Even if a knight was lying in 3 pieces, his gauntlets could be sold. His helmet could be patched up and reused. So flocks of scavengers descended. Sometimes villagers, sometimes camp followers, sometimes entire gangs who specialized in looting corpses. One chronicler complained that after the Battle of Agincourt, French peasants stripped knights so thoroughly that bodies were left naked in the mud. Nobles lost not just their lives, but their dignity, which for a medieval aristocrat was basically worse than death. And it wasn't just equipment. Clothes, jewelry, even teeth were taken. Human remains became commodities. Not glamorous ones, but hey, in a world where you recycled everything, a battlefield was a gold mine. Recycling bones. Now, here's a detail you probably don't want when you're trying to sleep. Bones were sometimes reused. Not in the way of fancy relics, but practically. Bones could be ground down for fertilizer. Farmers noticed that fields near battle sites sometimes grew oddly lush crops, and they weren't wrong. Calcium and phosphorus are plant nutrients. You see where this is going? And if you're picturing medieval people sprinkling powdered femur over their cabbages, well, yes, that happened. Sometimes intentionally, sometimes just by plowing through shallow graves. Agriculture had a way of recycling everything, even if the farmers didn't admit it out loud. Skulls also turned up as curiosities. Some monasteries displayed them as grim warnings. Others ended up in taverns or private homes. Conversation piece takes on a whole new meaning when it's literally a head on the shelf. Now on to the pettier side of things, because medieval kings loved a posthumous insult. If you really hated an enemy, you didn't just defeat him, you dug him up later to prove your point. Take poor Harold Harefoot, an early English king. After his death in 1040, his rival Harthacnut had him exhumed, dragged through the streets, and dumped in the Toms. Very dignified. Monks eventually rescued the corpse and reburied it, but the message was clear. Even in death, you couldn't rest if the wrong king was in charge. Or consider the popes. Oh yes, popes did this too. The infamous Cadaver Synod of 897, Pope Stephen VI put the corpse of his predecessor, Formosus, on trial. They dressed up the 9-month-old corpse in papal robes, propped it on a throne, and screamed accusations at it. Unsurprisingly, the dead pope was found guilty. His body was thrown into the Tiber. It doesn't get more medieval than suing a corpse. And on battlefields, this attitude carried over. Victors sometimes ordered the bones of old enemies dug up and reburied in unconsecrated ground. A symbolic act. Less rest in peace, more rest in humiliation. Famous cases of corpses on display. Sometimes kings didn't bury bodies at all. They displayed them. Take William Wallace again. After his execution, his head was stuck on London Bridge while his arms and legs were scattered around Scotland. Not exactly restful. And although this wasn't technically a battlefield corpse, it shows how much value there was in using bodies as propaganda. In the case of defeated nobles, their corpses might be paraded before being tossed in a pit. It wasn't just about punishment. It was about theater. Crowds gathered, gossip spread. The body itself became part of the narrative of power. And when burial took years, here's something else. Not all battlefields were cleaned up immediately. Some just weren't. Weather made impossible digging. Armies marched away and never came back. Villagers were too poor or too frightened to handle the task, which meant corpses lay out for months or even years. Skeletons littered the ground until finally someone got around to gathering them. At Morgarten in 1315, where Swiss peasants crushed a Habsburg army, reports suggest that bones were still visible in the passes decades later. Travelers described them bleaching in the sun, reminders of the humiliation of the great noble houses. It wasn't just neglect, it was a warning left in plain sight. And so these battlefields became more than just graves. They became reputations, places people avoided, places where the air was unclean. Entire villages lived in the shadow of mass death. The bones beneath the soil shaped memory, economy, and superstition. And ironically, many of these same sites are now tourist attractions. Towton has walking paths, Visby is a heritage site, Hastings is a school field trip destination. People picnic where it once rotted. Time smooths out even the worst smells, apparently. We'll pause here before moving into Part 5. Next, we'll drift over to some of the strangest recorded aftermaths. Noble corpses going missing, skeletons showing up in unexpected places, and the occasional case of mistaken identity when entire armies couldn't figure out which noble corpse was which.
Part 5. Lost Bodies and Mistaken Graves. We've covered scavengers, bones and cabbages, and the occasional pope suing a corpse. Now let's slide into the weirdest category of all, the mystery corpses, the missing bodies, the mistaken burials, and the nobles who somehow managed to be both dead and not dead at the same time, depending on who you asked. The case of the missing kings. Battlefields were chaotic. Thousands dead, thousands fleeing. And when it came time to account for the fallen, things didn't always add up. Sometimes, very important corpses simply vanished. Take Harold Godwinson again, back at Hastings. Did he get an arrow in the eye? Or was he hacked down by Norman knights? Or, as one suspiciously optimistic account claims, did he actually survive, fled to a hermitage and lived quietly as a monk? Nobody could agree. And part of the reason is simple. Nobody could reliably identify his body. Some claimed William deliberately concealed it. Others said his corpse was so mangled only his mistress could tell it was him. Either way, the missing king narrative stuck around, fueling centuries of speculation. Then there's Alaric, the Visigoth. Not medieval exactly, but worth mentioning. After sacking Rome in 410, he died suddenly in Italy. His men supposedly diverted a river, buried him beneath it, then let the water flow back, hiding the grave forever. Every worker was killed afterward to keep the secret. Medieval chroniclers loved this story. A king's body swallowed by the earth itself. Convenient if you never want grave robbers snooping around. Mistaken identity. Now let's imagine the practical side. You're on a battlefield and someone says, "Find my lord's body." Except there are 10,000 lords. Everyone wore armor. Helmets covered faces. Decay set in quickly. Identification was frankly guesswork. This led to hilarious, well, darkly hilarious mistakes. Families claimed they had their noble son's remains, only for rival families to say, "No, that's our guy." A skull here, a shin bone there, and suddenly you've got two tombs for one night. Medieval Europe was full of duplicate relics, and the same thing happened with battlefield burials. One famous confusion came after the Battle of Aljubarrota in Portugal, 1385. So many Castilian nobles were slaughtered that monks couldn't sort them. Bones were piled together, and centuries later, people were still debating which grave belonged to whom. In the end, everyone just pretended they knew, because nothing says family pride like confidently praying over the wrong skeleton.
corpses that reappeared. And then there were the bodies that wouldn't stay put. Heavy rains eroded shallow graves. Dogs dragged bones into villages. Farmers unearthed skulls with plows. Imagine planting barley only to find a knight's jawbone staring up at you. Entire generations grew up with battlefield remains popping up like grim Easter eggs. One chronicler described children playing with bones after Towton, using skulls as makeshift balls. Casual medieval entertainment. Not exactly Xbox, but it passed the time. And corpses as political tools. And sometimes not having a body was politically useful. If your king's corpse vanished, you could spread rumors he was still alive. Pretenders popped up, claiming to be the lost ruler. I'm Harold, back from Hastings. I'm Richard II, escaped from Pontefract Castle. These stories fueled rebellions and gave hope to people who didn't like the new king. It was the medieval equivalent of celebrity conspiracy theories. Elvis lives, except it was usually Harold lives, or the boy prince escaped. No photographs, no DNA tests. Just gossip and a suspiciously vague corpse. At the end of the day, medieval battlefields left a lot of unanswered questions. Some bodies lost forever, some mistaken, some recycled. And through it all, everyone tried to impose dignity on what was in reality a messy, smelly, confusing process. A noble might end up in a golden tomb, or in a mass pit spooning with his enemy. A king might be remembered as gloriously buried, or be discovered under a parking lot centuries later. History has a sense of humor that way. We'll pause here again, before gliding into Part 6. Next, we'll explore the long cultural memory of these graves, how poets and chroniclers used them to moralize, how saints were invented out of corpses, and how entire towns defined themselves by the bones beneath their feet.
Part 6. Bones, Myths, and Marketing. By now, we've wandered through pits, scavengers, and missing kings. But medieval people didn't just leave corpses behind. They built stories around them. The bones under the soil weren't just bones. They became morals, myths, and sometimes marketing material. Poets and moral lessons. Chroniclers couldn't resist turning mass death into a sermon. After Towton, writers described the battlefield as proof of God's judgment on prideful nobles. After Hastings, the Norman scribes painted Harold's fate as divine punishment for breaking his oath to William. In other words, your corpse wasn't just rotting in a ditch. It was a footnote in God's moral lesson plan. Poets loved to wax poetic about skeletons, too. They'd write lines about bones bleaching in the sun, swords rusting beside them, and the futility of earthly glory. Very memento mori chic. Which, in fairness, probably did help some knight remember to pray between tournaments and feasts. Saints from the battlefield. Some corpses were upgraded. If you died in the right circumstances, say during a crusade or while defending the faith, your bones might be collected and treated as relics. Monks wrote glowing hagiographies about men who supposedly glowed with light in death, or whose corpses gave off a sweet smell instead of rotting. Never mind that most battlefields smelled like a butcher's bin in July. A little creative writing went a long way. Before long, a knight hacked apart on some anonymous hill might be transformed into a saint whose relics drew pilgrims and donations. Towns built on bones. Battlefields could reshape entire communities. Towns that sat near mass graves often leaned into the history. Shrines were built, chapels sprang up, pilgrims came to pray where so many souls departed, which, naturally, meant money for the locals. One example, the Battle of Grunwald in 1410, where the Polish-Lithuanian alliance crushed the Teutonic Knights.
For decades afterward, pilgrims visited the battlefield, and the order itself turned the graves of its fallen knights into symbols of martyrdom. Nothing like using a pile of skeletons as recruitment propaganda. Bones as warnings. Sometimes the bones weren't buried deep, and people left them visible on purpose. Travelers passing battlefields described skulls lining the roads or rib cages half buried in the mud. It wasn't always laziness. Sometimes it was deliberate, a warning. This is what happens if you cross the wrong king. Even in towns, bones might be displayed as deterrents. Gallows fields doubled as reminders, but so did battle pits. If you were a peasant, you got the point. Life was short, war was ugly, and rebellion didn't pay. The long memory of bones. Centuries later, bones were still turning up. Farmers plowing in Towton fields in the 18th century complained about striking skeletons. Victorian tourists dug up skulls to take home as souvenirs, and archaeologists in the 20th century found Visby's armored corpses still haunting the trenches. And even now, places like Hastings or Bannockburn trade on the memory of mass graves. History sells. The bones that once terrified villagers now draw tourists in T-shirts. The restless dead have been rebranded as heritage. And here's where we float to a gentle close for this section. Medieval battlefields started as logistical nightmares. Too many corpses, too few shovels, too much stink. But over time, the same sites became holy or legendary or profitable. Bones that once cursed the land now fertilized myth and memory. It's a strange kind of recycling. Death feeding crops, corpses feeding stories, a battlefield feeding the reputation of kings and towns. In the end, medieval people turned the most uncomfortable reality into the thing they understood best, a story with morals, saints, and a touch of profit. We'll pause here before drifting into part 7, where we'll wrap this long night with the legacy, how modern digs, parking lots, and even DNA tests keep rewriting what really happened to those medieval bodies.
Part 7. Modern Bones and Old Stories. So far, we've been drifting through medieval chronicles, monks with quills, peasants with shovels, nobles with very inconvenient corpses. But of course, the story doesn't actually end in the 15th century, because the bones didn't go anywhere. They stayed right where they were, under fields, under towns, waiting for us to stumble on them again. Rediscovering the lost. The most famous case is, of course, Richard III, the king who died at Bosworth in 1485, hastily dumped in a friary grave, then vanished from memory. People argued for centuries about where he was, maybe dug up, maybe thrown in a river, maybe destroyed during the dissolution. But in 2012, there he was, under a parking lot in Leicester. Spine curved, skull cracked, bones telling the story of his last brutal moments. It was poetic in a weird way. A king once vilified, rediscovered under asphalt, then given a proper cathedral burial 500 years late. Medieval indignity transformed into modern ceremony. Archaeology of the mass pits. Excavations keep peeling back layers of these old fields. At Towton, digs uncovered skeletons with horrific injuries, skulls split, teeth shattered, jawbones cleaved in half. Evidence that matched the chroniclers, but with a visceral detail no parchment ever captured. At Visby, the armored corpses were studied bone by bone, their injuries mapped, their malnutrition traced. Suddenly, the nameless peasants of 1361 weren't just the losers. They were individuals with arthritis, bad teeth,
and broken childhood bones, forced to fight in armor that didn't fit. Their mass grave became a time capsule. And these digs don't just answer questions, they create new ones. Why were some bodies stripped and others not? Why do some pits show neat rows while others look like corpses were literally tossed in head first? Archaeology brings us closer, but also shows just how messy medieval logistics really were. DNA and family trees. Modern science adds another layer. DNA tests have linked ancient bones to living descendants. Richard III's identity was confirmed by comparing his remains to a Canadian carpenter descended from his sister. Imagine finding out your uncle 16 generations back was the king buried under a car park. Thanksgiving just got awkward. Other projects try to trace the origins of armies. Were the soldiers at Towton all local Englishmen, or were some foreign mercenaries? DNA might tell us. Were crusader pits in the Holy Land filled with European knights, or did locals get caught up too? Slowly, we're learning. And here's where the gentle irony comes in. Medieval people worried endlessly about proper burial, consecrated ground, prayers, tombs, dignity. They feared wandering souls if they didn't get it right. But in the end, most of them ended up forgotten in ditches, or under fields, or ground into fertilizer. And it's only now, centuries later, that we dig them up, study them, put them in museums, or sometimes rebury them with honors they never got in life. The afterlife is long. Sometimes it includes a cameo on a documentary channel. Closing drift. So, what happened to the bodies after famous medieval battles? They were shoveled into pits. They were looted. They were boiled, scattered, displayed, mistaken, forgotten, rediscovered. They fertilized fields, haunted villages, became relics, and eventually heritage sites. Every corpse had a story, but most were anonymous, just bones in the mud. And yet those bones shaped memory. They kept kings humble. They gave monks sermons. They haunted peasants. They still whisper today from trenches and car parks alike. So as we close this long night's wander, maybe remember, beneath every quiet meadow in Europe, there just might be 1,000 medieval soldiers still lying there, waiting for someone with a spade to remind the world that they once mattered. Sleep well with that thought.